The 201, I don't see any runway. Are you sure about this one?
Trust me, Tom. Wallops Island has a 10,000-foot runway. You can do it.
They called her just an observer until she saved 3 lives and changed everything. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell sat in the back seat, relegated to observer status after choosing to attempt a risky landing instead of ejecting. When Commander Jackson collapsed at 25,000 feet and Lieutenant Parker's engine failed during the rescue, the woman they dismissed as unfit to fly became the only thing standing between 3 pilots and disaster. The morning briefing room at NAS Oceana buzzed with controlled energy as naval aviators prepared for another day of training flights. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell sat in the back row, her flight suit bearing the subdued insignia of someone whose wings had been clipped. At 28, Sarah had been one of the most promising pilots in her class at Pensacola, with reflexes instructors called supernatural and spatial awareness that made complex maneuvers look effortless. That was before the incident 6 months ago that had ended her career as a pilot. Observer, she thought bitterly, watching Commander Rick Jackson review the day's flight plan, a fancy word for passenger. The incident replayed in her mind like a broken record. During a training exercise, her instructor, Commander Dale Morrison, had simulated a catastrophic engine failure requiring immediate ejection. Standard protocol was clear: when the instructor calls for ejection, you eject. But Sarah had seen something Morrison missed: a small airfield within gliding distance, a chance to save a multi-million-dollar aircraft instead of punching out over the ocean. She'd made the split-second decision to attempt an emergency landing, executing a dead-stick approach that would have been textbook perfect if it hadn't violated direct orders. Reckless endangerment, Morrison had written. Failure to follow emergency procedures demonstrates poor judgment under pressure. The review board had agreed despite Sarah's flawless execution. She'd been stripped of her pilot status and assigned to observer duties, a career death sentence in naval aviation. Mitchell, Commander Jackson called out, "You're with me today. We're running intercept training with the new guys." Sarah nodded, noting the mixture of pity and disdain in other pilots' eyes. They saw her as a cautionary tale, a talented pilot who'd let ego override judgment. If they only knew, Sarah thought as she followed Jackson to the flight line. If they only knew what Morrison really said in that cockpit. The truth was more complicated than the official report suggested. Morrison's emergency had been deliberately designed to fail her part of a pattern Sarah was only beginning to understand. But proving it would require more than accusations. It would require an opportunity to demonstrate that her recklessness was actually calculated risk-taking that separated good pilots from great ones. That opportunity was about to present itself in ways Sarah never could have imagined. The FA-18 Super Hornet climbed through 15,000 feet, its twin engines providing the familiar symphony Sarah had missed more than she cared to admit. In the front seat, Commander Jackson ran through the training scenario with professional precision. "How's the view back there, Mitchell?" Jackson asked, his tone carrying casual condescension. "Outstanding, sir," Sarah replied, though her attention focused on instrument displays rather than scenery. Even as an observer, she monitored every system, tracked every radio call, mentally flew the aircraft alongside the actual pilot. The training mission tested intercept procedures against simulated threat skills Sarah had mastered during pilot training, but was now only allowed to watch others practice. "Hornet 201, this is Control," came the voice from the carrier. "Vector 090 Angels 20. You have traffic bearing 270, range 50 miles. Jackson acknowledged and banked into the intercept course, his movements smooth and professional. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with tactical flying, even as a passenger. "This should be me flying," she thought. "I know these procedures better than most pilots in this squadron." The first sign of trouble came as a subtle change in Jackson's radio calls. His usually crisp communications became slightly slurred responses, delayed by seconds most people wouldn't notice. Sarah noticed. "Sir," she said over the intercom, "are you feeling all right?" "Fine, Mitchell," Jackson replied, but his voice carried confusion that hadn't been there before. "Just concentrating on the intercept." Sarah watched Jackson's movements more carefully, noting how his head occasionally drooped before snapping back up. The symptoms were subtle, but unmistakable to someone who'd studied aerospace medicine. Hypoxia, she realized with growing alarm. He's not getting enough oxygen. "Commander Jackson, I think you should check your oxygen system," Sarah said, her voice calm despite adrenaline flooding her system. "Oxygen's fine," Jackson mumbled, but his speech was becoming increasingly slurred. Everything's normal." Sarah looked at her own oxygen display and saw the problem immediately. Jackson's flow indicator showed 0. His system had failed, and he was slowly suffocating at 20,000 feet. "Sir, your oxygen system has failed," Sarah said urgently. "You need to descend immediately." But Jackson was beyond hearing her now, his head lolling forward as hypoxia robbed his brain of oxygen. His hands fell away from the controls, and the Super Hornet began a gentle but inexorable climb toward even thinner air. Sarah had perhaps 30 seconds before Jackson lost consciousness completely. Emergency procedures were clear. As an observer, she should use the emergency radio to declare a mayday and hope other aircraft could guide them to safety. But Sarah had never been good at following procedures that didn't make sense. "Control, this is Hornet 201 Observer," she transmitted, reaching for the rear cockpit controls. "Pilot is unconscious due to oxygen system failure. I'm taking control of the aircraft." The silence that followed was deafening. An observer taking control of a military aircraft was unprecedented, potentially career-ending, and absolutely necessary. "Hornet 201, say again," came the shocked response. "Did you say observer has control?" "Affirmative, control. Lieutenant Mitchell has control. Pilot is unconscious, descending to 10,000 feet for emergency oxygen." Sarah's hands moved over familiar controls with muscle memory that 6 months of forced inactivity hadn't erased. The Super Hornet responded to her touch like an old friend, its systems coming alive under her command. "This is where I belong," she thought as she initiated the emergency descent, not watching from the back seat, but flying. As the aircraft descended toward breathable air, Sarah understood that her career was probably over again. But some things were more important than careers, and she'd rather be court-martialed for saving a life than decorated for following procedures that led to unnecessary deaths. At 10,000 feet, Commander Jackson began to stir as oxygen returned to his brain. Sarah had been monitoring his vitals while simultaneously flying the Super Hornet and coordinating with air traffic control, a workload that would have challenged even experienced pilots. What happened?" Jackson mumbled, his voice weak but coherent. Oxygen system failure, sir. You've been unconscious for about 10 minutes. I've been flying the aircraft. Jackson tried to reach for the controls, but Sarah could see he was still severely impaired. Hypoxia recovery took time, and his motor skills were nowhere near adequate for controlling a high-performance aircraft. Sir, I need you to stay calm and let me handle the flying, Sarah said firmly. Can you help me assess our system's status? Jackson's training kicked in despite his condition, and he began reading through warning displays with methodical approach. Jesus, he whispered as the scope of their problems became clear. The oxygen failure was just the beginning. We've got electrical problems, hydraulic warnings, and... He paused, his voice taking on genuine fear. Sarah, the fuel system is showing anomalies. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she processed the implications. What had started as a simple oxygen system failure was cascading into multiple system failures that could make the aircraft unflyable. Control Hornet 201, she transmitted. We have multiple system failures beyond the initial oxygen problem. Request immediate vector to nearest suitable airfield. Hornet 201 control. Nearest suitable field is NAS Norfolk, bearing 180 range 45 miles. Be advised, weather is deteriorating rapidly. As Sarah turned toward Norfolk, another voice cut through the radio chatter with urgent desperation. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Hornet 203. I have complete engine failure and am unable to reach any suitable airfield. Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized the voice Lieutenant Tom Parker, a young pilot on his first deployment who'd been struggling with confidence issues. Hornet 203, this is Control. State your position and intentions. Control, I'm at 15,000 feet 30 miles northwest of Norfolk. Engine is completely dead, and I'm losing altitude rapidly. I don't think I can make it to any runway. Sarah quickly calculated Parker's position and glide ratio, her mind automatically running through emergency procedures she'd memorized years ago. Parker was in serious trouble too far from Norfolk to glide to the main runway, and the weather was making alternative fields unsuitable. But there was one option everyone else was missing. Control, this is Hornet 201, Sarah transmitted. I'm familiar with an emergency strip at Wallops Island. It's within Lieutenant Parker's glide range. Hornet 201, you are not authorized to provide tactical guidance. Maintain your current heading to Norfolk. Sarah felt anger flare as she realized bureaucratic protocol was about to cost Parker his life. The emergency strip at Wallops was a classified facility most pilots didn't know existed, but Sarah had studied every airfield on the East Coast during her training. Sir, she said to Jackson, who was slowly recovering, Parker's going to die if someone doesn't guide him to Wallops. Jackson looked at her with eyes still clouded by oxygen deprivation. Sarah, you're not authorized to break formation. We have our own emergency to deal with. Sarah watched on radar as Parker's aircraft continued its inexorable descent toward the ocean. In 5 minutes, he would be too low to reach any airfield, and his only option would be ejection over water. Dangerous in the deteriorating weather. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. Sarah thought remembering words her father had spoken before his own military career ended in controversy. Control, this is Hornet 201. Sarah transmitted, banking away from her assigned heading. I'm proceeding to assist Hornet 203 with emergency navigation to Wallops Island. Hornet 201 negative, you are ordered to proceed directly to Norfolk. Do not deviate from assigned heading. But Sarah was already committed. She'd been branded as reckless for making split-second decisions that saved lives and equipment, and she wasn't about to let another pilot die because she was afraid to take risks. "Hornet 203, this is Hornet 201, she called to Parker. "I'm going to guide you to an emergency strip. Follow my lead and trust me." "Sarah, what are you doing?" Jackson asked, his voice stronger now but still confused. "What I should have been allowed to do 6 months ago," Sarah replied, "saving lives instead of following procedures that don't make sense." As she led Parker toward the emergency strip that could save his life, Sarah understood that her career was probably over. But some things were more important than careers, and she'd rather be court-martialed for saving a life than decorated for following orders that led to unnecessary deaths. The radio crackled with increasingly urgent orders to return to course, but Sarah ignored them all, focusing instead on the life or death navigation problem of getting Parker safely to the ground. Sarah's unauthorized deviation had triggered a crisis at multiple command levels. Her radio crackled with increasingly urgent orders to return to assigned heading, but she ignored them all, focusing instead on the life or death navigation problem. "Hornet 203, this is 201, Sarah transmitted, her voice calm despite the chaos. "I need you to turn to heading 095 and begin a controlled descent to 8,000 feet. You're going to make it." 201, "I can't see any runway," Parker replied, his voice tight with fear. "Are you sure about this strip?" "Trust me, Tom. I've studied every emergency field on the coast. Wallops Island has a 10,000-foot runway that's perfect for emergency landings." But even as she spoke, Sarah could see weather deteriorating rapidly. Clouds were building from the west, and visibility was dropping to levels that would make any landing challenging, let alone an emergency approach by a pilot with a dead engine. "Sarah," Jackson said, his voice now clear as he recovered from hypoxia, "you're risking both our lives for someone who might not make it anyway." "He'll make it," Sarah replied with conviction she didn't entirely feel. "I'm going to make sure of it." The emergency strip at Wallops Island appeared through the haze like a lifeline, a long concrete runway surrounded by marshland and protected by security fences, marking it as a government facility. Sarah had never actually landed there, but she'd memorized its specifications during her obsessive study of emergency procedures. "Hornet 203 runway in sight, bearing 090, range 8 miles, Sarah called out. "You're lined up perfectly for a straight-in approach." "I see it," Parker's voice carried new hope. "But I'm coming in fast and high. I don't think I can make the touchdown zone." Sarah quickly calculated Parker's energy state and approach angle, her mind automatically running through emergency procedures she'd practiced countless times in simulators. "Tom, you need to execute a forward slip to lose altitude and airspeed. Drop your gear and flaps, then use rudder to create drag." "I've never done a forward slip in a Super Hornet." "You can do this," Sarah said firmly. "I'm going to talk you through it step by step." As Parker began his emergency approach, Sarah realized her own aircraft's problems were getting worse. The electrical failures were affecting her flight controls, and Jackson was still too impaired to take over flying duties. "Control, this is Hornet 201, she transmitted. "I'm experiencing degraded flight controls and need immediate priority handling for Norfolk." "Hornet 201, you're not authorized for priority handling. You violated direct orders and are subject to immediate disciplinary action upon landing." Sarah felt cold fury building as she realized the same bureaucratic mindset that had destroyed her career was now threatening to cost lives. "Control, I have a pilot who's about to attempt an emergency landing with no engine, and I have my own emergency with degraded systems. I don't give a damn about your disciplinary action." The radio fell silent as controllers processed the unprecedented situation of an observer pilot conducting two simultaneous emergency operations while defying direct orders. "Hornet 203, you're looking good," Sarah called as Parker's aircraft approached the runway. "Maintain your glide path and prepare for touchdown." Parker's Super Hornet touched down hard on the Wallops runway, its tires smoking as the aircraft rolled to a stop well within the available distance. Sarah felt a surge of relief as she watched Parker climb out of his cockpit, alive and uninjured. "Outstanding work, Tom," she transmitted. "You just executed a perfect dead-stick landing." "I couldn't have done it without you, Sarah. You saved my life." But Sarah's own emergency was far from over. Her aircraft's electrical problems were getting worse, and she still had to get Jackson safely to Norfolk despite his ongoing impairment from hypoxia. "Control, this is Hornet 201, she transmitted. "Hornet 203 is safely on deck at Wallops. I'm now proceeding to Norfolk with degraded systems and an impaired pilot." "Hornet 201, you are cleared direct Norfolk priority handling. Emergency equipment is standing by." As Sarah turned toward Norfolk, she understood that her unauthorized rescue of Parker had probably ended her military career permanently. But watching him walk away from what should have been a fatal accident, she knew she'd made the right choice. Some things are more important than following orders, she thought. Some things are worth any sacrifice. The woman they'd called just an observer had just proven that sometimes the most important flights were the ones that broke all the rules. The conference room at NAS Oceana was packed with more brass than Sarah had ever seen in one place. Admiral Rebecca Stevens, the base commander, sat at the head of the table flanked by captains, commanders, and investigators whose expressions ranged from curious to openly hostile. Sarah stood at attention, still wearing the flight suit from yesterday's emergency, facing what she assumed would be the end of her military career. The charges were serious: disobeying direct orders, unauthorized deviation from flight plan, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Admiral Stevens began, "yesterday's events have raised serious questions about your judgment and fitness for military service." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was facing. "However," Stevens continued, "they've also raised questions about the circumstances that led to your current status as an observer." Sarah felt a flicker of hope as she realized the investigation might be broader than she'd expected. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, the squadron's senior intelligence officer, stood to address the board. "Admiral, our investigation has revealed disturbing patterns in Commander Morrison's training evaluations." Rodriguez activated a presentation that made Morrison's face go pale. "Over the past 3 years, Commander Morrison has recommended the removal of 7 female pilots from training programs. In each case, the stated reason was poor judgment under pressure or failure to follow procedures." Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized the scope of what was being revealed. "Furthermore," Rodriguez continued, "we've discovered that Commander Morrison has been deliberately creating scenarios designed to force female pilots into no-win situations, then using their responses as justification for removal from training." Admiral Stevens turned to Morrison, with an expression that could have frozen the Atlantic. "Commander, is this true?" "Admiral, I maintain the highest standards for all pilots regardless of gender." "That's not what I asked." Stevens cut him off. "Did you deliberately design scenarios to fail female pilots?" Morrison's silence was answer enough. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Stevens said, "we've also reviewed the cockpit voice recordings from your training incident 6 months ago." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that her conversation with Morrison had been recorded. The recordings reveal that Commander Morrison made several inappropriate comments about your gender and your fitness for military service. Comments that were not included in his official report. Stevens played a portion of the recording that made Sarah's blood boil. Morrison's voice saying, "Women don't belong in fighter cockpits. They're too emotional, too weak to make the hard decisions." Furthermore, Stevens continued, "The recordings show that you attempted to discuss alternative solutions to the simulated emergency, but Commander Morrison refused to consider them." Sarah remembered that conversation, her attempts to point out the nearby airfield, Morrison's dismissive responses, his insistence that ejection was the only acceptable option. Based on this evidence, Stevens announced, "Commander Morrison is hereby relieved of all training duties and will face a formal investigation for discrimination and abuse of authority." Lieutenant Mitchell, Admiral Stevens said, "You have been the victim of systematic discrimination that has no place in the United States Navy. Your pilot status is hereby restored, effective immediately." Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time in months as the weight of vindication settled on her shoulders. "Furthermore," Stevens continued, "your actions yesterday demonstrate exactly the kind of judgment and courage we need in our pilots. You saved 3 lives, Commander Jackson, Lieutenant Parker, and potentially yourself through quick thinking and superior airmanship." The Admiral stood and walked around the table to face Sarah directly. "Lieutenant, I'm recommending you for immediate acceptance into the Navy's elite test pilot program. Your combination of technical skill and moral courage makes you exactly the kind of officer we need." After the formal proceedings, Commander Jackson approached Sarah with genuine remorse. "Sarah," he said, "I owe you an apology, not just for yesterday, but for the past 6 months. I should have spoken up about Morrison's treatment of you." "You were following the chain of command," Sarah replied. "I understand." "No, you don't understand," Jackson said firmly. "I was being a coward. I saw what Morrison was doing to you and other female pilots, and I said nothing because it was easier than confronting discrimination." He extended his hand. "I want you to know that you're one of the finest pilots I've ever flown with. What you did yesterday saving Parker while dealing with our own emergency, that was extraordinary flying." Lieutenant Parker found Sarah in the squadron ready room, his face showing the gratitude of someone who'd been given a second chance at life. "Sarah," he said, "I wanted to thank you for yesterday. You didn't just save my life, you showed me what real courage looks like. You did the hard part, Tom. You flew that approach and made that landing. Only because you guided me through it," Parker replied. "You never gave up on me, even when everyone else was telling you to follow orders." As the day concluded, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from disgrace to vindication. The woman who'd been branded as reckless had proven that sometimes the most dangerous thing wasn't taking risks. It was refusing to take them when lives were at stake. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell stood on the flight line at Pax River, watching as the latest class of test pilot candidates prepared for their first flights in experimental aircraft. Her promotion had come through 3 months earlier, along with assignment to lead the Navy's first comprehensive program for eliminating bias in pilot training. "Ma'am," said Lieutenant Jennifer Hayes, one of her students, "the new evaluation protocols you developed are being implemented fleet-wide. Early reports show a significant increase in female pilot retention." Sarah smiled, remembering her own struggles with discriminatory instructors. "The protocols are just tools, Lieutenant. The real change comes from people like you proving that excellence has nothing to do with gender." The program Sarah had developed was revolutionary in its simplicity, standardized scenarios, objective evaluation criteria, and mandatory bias training for all instructors. But more importantly, it had created a culture where discrimination was no longer tolerated or ignored. "What about Commander Morrison?" Hayes asked. "Court-martialed and dismissed from service," Sarah replied. "His case prompted a Navy-wide investigation that identified and removed 17 other instructors with similar patterns of discrimination." As they walked toward the hangar, where Sarah's current test aircraft waited, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from observer status to test pilot program director. The incident that had nearly ended her career had become the catalyst for changes that would benefit generations of female aviators. "Ma'am," Hayes said, "I wanted you to know that you're the reason I applied for test pilot school. Watching you stand up to discrimination and save lives showed me what real leadership looks like." Sarah felt the familiar warmth that came from knowing her struggles had meaning beyond personal vindication. "Lieutenant, the most important thing I can teach you is that being a great pilot isn't about following orders blindly. It's about having the courage to do what's right, even when it costs you everything." As her experimental aircraft lifted off into the Maryland sky, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that she'd helped create a Navy where talent and courage mattered more than gender or politics. The woman they'd called just an observer had become a leader who'd opened doors that could never be closed again. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that change everything for those who come after, she thought her father's words echoing across the years. And some fights are worth any sacrifice.